At 44 years old, Ruth Calloway stood on the porch of the boarding house she had run for 11 years, watching the new owner's men carry her belongings into the yard. Evicted by a landlord's nephew who had inherited the property and decided a widow's modest rent could no longer compete with his plans to sell the building outright, she left with $14, a hope chest, and a mule named Barnabus too stubborn for anyone else to want. And by the following afternoon, she had heard the talk down at the feed store about an old salt works on the edge of Munro County, Kansas, flooded years back when the creek jumped its banks, sitting abandoned and useless on land nobody would touch. Ruth paid $5 for it, and the men at the feed store laughed outright, telling her she'd bought herself a swamp and a headache. She said nothing about what she'd noticed, half sunk in the mud beside the ruined boiling sheds. An old delivery cart with a seat that did not sit quite level, and what she would find beneath it would not just save her. It would settle a debt the whole county had forgotten it owed. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Ruth Calloway, if you've ever been told you were foolish for trusting your own instincts over everyone else's laughter. We hope you'll tell us in the comments where you're watching from tonight. Ruth had been born, Ruth Ann Whitfield, in 1844 on a modest homestead outside Council Grove, Kansas, the eldest of 4 children to a father, Silas Whitfield, who worked as a wheelwright in Cooper, and a mother, Nora, who ran the household's finances with an exacting hand that left nothing to chance and nothing to waste. It was Silas who taught Ruth, from the time she was old enough to hold a plane steady, the patient discipline of working with wood and iron, showing her how a wheel's spokes had to be seated with exact, even pressure, or the whole assembly would fail under load, how a barrel's staves had to be shaped and fitted with a craftsman's respect for the material's own grain and tendency, never forced against what the wood itself wanted to do. Wood remembers how it was cut, Silas used to tell her, running his thumb along a fresh plain board in the lamplight of his workshop, and if you fight it, it'll fight you back for years. Ruth absorbed this lesson the way she absorbed most of her father's teaching, without fully understanding its depth until much later in life, when she came to recognize how often the same was true of people and of places that had been mishandled by careless hands. Her mother, Nora, meanwhile, instilled in Ruth a different but complementary discipline, the strict, unsentimental keeping of household accounts, insisting that her daughter understand every figure in the family ledger before she was 14. Because, as Nora put it plainly over the kitchen table each evening, a woman who cannot read her own numbers will spend her whole life being told what they mean by someone with reason to lie to her. Ruth's 3 younger brothers, Thomas, Peter, and young Eli, grew up expected to inherit their father's trade in some fashion, while Ruth, despite showing an aptitude for woodworking that occasionally outpaced her brothers, was gently steered by both of her parents' generation and their neighbors' expectations toward the more conventional path of marriage and household management, though Silas never discouraged her interest in his workshop the way some fathers of that era might have, and often kept her at his side on Saturday mornings, long after her brothers had wandered off to other pursuits. Ruth married Jacob Calloway in 1865, a steady, soft-spoken freight hauler who ran a small transport business along the trade routes connecting Council Grove to the growing rail towns further west, and who valued his wife's sharp practical mind rather than feeling diminished by it, much as her own father had valued her aptitude in his workshop. They settled in the small county seat of Munro, Kansas, and built together a modest but sufficient life, Jacob hauling freight and Ruth keeping his accounts and, in time, managing a small boarding house they purchased together to supplement the family's income during the lean years when freight contracts grew scarce. They had one daughter, Iris, born in 1868, who grew into a bright and independent young woman before marrying a homesteader and moving with him to the Nebraska Territory in 1886, a departure that left Ruth's household quieter but her heart She would later admit, no less full. Jacob died in the winter of 1889, thrown from his wagon during an ice storm on the freight road. And Ruth, then 42, found herself a widow managing the boarding house alone. Her freight business sold off to settle Jacob's modest debts. Her daughter a full state away and unable to offer more than letters and the occasional visit. She managed well enough for 2 years, running the boarding house with the same careful hand her mother had trained into her, until the building's owner, an elderly widower named Cornelius Pratt, who had always dealt with Ruth fairly and charged her a rent she could manage, passed away himself, leaving the property to a nephew from Topeka named Garrett Pratt, who had no interest in continuing his uncle's modest arrangement with a longtime tenant when he could sell the building outright to a hotel concern eager to expand into Munro's growing rail trade. Garrett gave Ruth 30 days to vacate, a technically generous window by the Fazu letter of the law, but one that gave her little practical time to find alternative arrangements in a county where boarding houses and rental rooms were scarce and where a woman past 40 with no husband and no trade beyond housekeeping and modest bookkeeping found few doors readily open to her. She spent her last weeks in Munro writing to every contact she and Jacob had once known, finding nothing that would take her in without more money than she possessed. And on the appointed day, she packed what little the law recognized as hers alone into her old hope chest, saddled Barnabus, the stubborn mule Jacob had once used for light freight work and which nobody had bothered to include in the estate's more valuable assets, and walked away from the boarding house with $14 to her name and genuinely no fixed idea of where in Kansas widow of 44 with no family nearby might go. Next, she heard about the old salt works from 2 men loitering outside the feed store in the neighboring town of Ashford, discussing with evident amusement the county's upcoming sale of an abandoned salt operation out along Willow Creek, flooded some 4 years prior when spring rains had overwhelmed the creek's banks and silted the whole works with mud. The property considered such a worthless liability that the county assessor was practically giving it away just to stop the modest tax burden of an unproductive parcel. Ruth, resting Barnabus in the shade nearby, found herself listening with an attention she could not immediately explain. Some old instinct from her father's workshop stirring at the mention of a works gone to ruin, a thing built with purpose now simply abandoned rather than truly broken. The sale, held the following Tuesday at the Ashford Courthouse, drew a small crowd of men there, mostly for the entertainment of watching the county unload a worthless property. And when Ruth offered $5, laughter rippled through the small gathering, one man calling out that she'd bought herself nothing but mosquitoes and mud, another suggesting she ought to save her money for a proper roof over her head instead of a swamp. Ruth, who had learned from both her father's patient workshop lessons and her mother's exacting ledger training exactly how to let her room's laughter pass over her without reaching her face, simply signed the deed and walked out with Barnabas's lead rope in hand, toward a property 12 miles distant that not one of those laughing men would have taken for free. Asterisk. She arrived at the old salt works in the low golden light of early evening, and found precisely the ruin she had been promised: silted brine channels choked with reeds and creek debris. Boiling sheds collapsed on their western sides where the flood's initial surge had torn through support beams. Evaporation troughs cracked and half buried in dried mud. And standing near the largest collapsed shed, tilted at an odd angle where its wheels had sunk into ground long since dried to a cracked crust, an old delivery cart, clearly abandoned by whatever operation had run the works before the flood claimed it. Ruth spent that first night in the one shed still mostly intact, and the following morning, exhausted but restless in the way her father's old workshop instincts had always made her when faced with something broken and unexamined. She began walking the property with the same careful, Assessing eye Silas had trained into her decades before, testing beams for soundness, tracing the silted channels to judge how much labor their clearing might actually require, and finding, to her cautious surprise, that the underlying brine springs, when she dug a testing hole with a shovel salvaged from the collapsed shed, still ran strong and clear beneath the surface neglect. It was on her third day at the property, working to clear brush and salvage usable lumber from around the old cart in hopes of building a serviceable lean-to shelter before autumn turned to winter, that Ruth's attention caught on something her father's training had made instinctive. The cart's wooden seat did not sit quite level against its frame, tilting almost imperceptibly to one side in a way that spoke to a woodworker's trained eye, not of simple rot or warping, but of deliberate modification. A seat built or altered to accommodate something beneath it that ordinary wear would not explain. She worked at the seat's edge with a pry bar for the better part of an hour, and when it finally gave way, she found beneath it a shallow but carefully constructed hidden compartment, and within that compartment, wrapped in oiled canvas gone stiff with years of damp, a modest cache of silver coin alongside a folded letter, its ink faded but still legible, addressed simply to whoever finds this, in fairness. The letter, dated 1881 and signed by a woman named Henrietta Boone, the salt works' last proprietor before the flood, told a story that unfolded with each careful line Ruth read by lamplight that evening. Henrietta, it emerged, had run the salt works as a widow herself, having inherited it from her own late husband, and had spent years quietly paying above-market wages to the small crew of local families who worked her evaporation troughs and hauled her product to market. Families who, in the lean years following a regional drought, had come to depend on the salt works' wages as the difference between solvency and ruin. Henrietta's letter recorded, with the plain candor of a woman writing for no audience but her own conscience, that she had set aside a portion of her profits each season specifically as a hidden reserve fund, intended to be distributed among her workers' families in any year the harvest or trade routes failed badly enough to threaten their survival. Money she deliberately kept hidden rather than banked, having watched too many county banks fail in hard years to trust her workers' security to anyone's ledger but her own. The silver in the cart, her letter explained, represented the last undispersed portion of this reserve, set aside just before the flood that would, unbeknownst to her at the time of writing, destroy the salt works entirely within the year and force her, ailing and without resources to rebuild, to leave the county for relatives in the east. Her careful provision for her workers' hardship left behind in a hiding place she had intended to reveal before circumstances overtook her, the deepening mystery, as Ruth pieced together over the following weeks with the same patient, methodical care her mother had modeled across a lifetime of ledgers, was this. Henrietta Boone's letter named 5 families by name who had depended on the salt works' wages, families whose names, when Ruth cross-referenced them against current Ashford residents with the help of a sympathetic young county recorder named Franklin Doyle, turned out to include descendants still living in modest circumstances throughout Munro County. Several of them, Ruth learned with a private, sobering recognition, having fallen into genuine hardship in recent years as the region's agricultural fortunes had soured. Ruth also learned, through careful inquiry at the county courthouse, the fuller and more troubling history of what had happened to Henrietta. Boone's own claim on the property after her departure. The land had passed through unpaid taxes into county ownership, and the eventual assessor's sale that had brought Ruth herself to the property had been arranged, she discovered with growing unease, by none other than Garrett Pratt's own business associate, a county land speculator named Silas Vance, who had been quietly buying up flooded and tax-delinquent parcels throughout the region for years at deliberately suppressed prices, using his position on the county's assessment board to keep such properties valued artificially low precisely, so he and his associates could acquire them cheaply before, eventually draining and redeveloping them for considerable profit once the region's rail expansion made the land valuable. Again, the conflict arrived the moment word of Ruth's discovery reached the wrong ears for Franklin Doyle. In his own careful diligence tracing the property's history, had inadvertently alerted Silas Vance's office to renewed interest in the old salt works, and Vance himself arrived at the property one October afternoon with an offer dressed as neighborly concern, proposing to buy the salt works from Ruth at a price considerably above her $5, citing worry for a widow alone on flood-prone land, though his manner carried an unmistakable undertone of a man eager to reclaim something he had not expected to lose so easily to an unconnected outsider. When Ruth declined, gently but without hesitation, Vance's friendliness cooled, and within days quiet pressure began appearing in small, deniable ways. A county inspector arrived unannounced to question whether Ruth's modest repairs to the boiling shed met proper county codes. A rumor circulated at the Ashford Mercantile, suggesting the widow Calloway had been seen behaving strangely at the flooded works, and Franklin Doyle himself received a quiet suggestion from a superior that perhaps his research into old land transactions was better directed elsewhere. Ruth, who had spent her whole adult life managing a boarding house full of difficult tenants and harder conversations, met this campaign not with confrontation but with the same unhurried, methodical patience her father had modeled in his workshop, continuing her careful documentation of Henrietta Boone's letter, the 5 families' verified descendants, and, with Franklin Doyle's quiet continued help even against his own superior's discomfort, the county assessment records that revealed the suspiciously suppressed valuations Vance had engineered across a dozen similar flooded properties over the preceding decade. The climax came on a cold, bright morning in late autumn when Ruth brought her full case before the county commission itself, at a public meeting held in the Ashford Town Hall and attended by a curious crowd who had heard enough scattered rumor by then to sense something significant was unfolding. She laid out, plainly and without embellishment, Henrietta Boone's original letter and its intended reserve fund, the verified identities of the 5 families' living descendants, several of whom sat in the audience that morning, having been quietly invited by Franklin Doyle, and finally, the pattern of suppressed assessments Vance had used to acquire flooded land throughout the county at prices far below its true recoverable value. Silas Vance, present in the room and visibly unsettled as the documentation mounted, attempted to dismiss the matter as ancient history irrelevant to present county business, but the commission's chairman, a plain-spoken farmer named Jedediah Snow, who had himself lost a modest parcel to a Vance-brokered tax sale some years before, and had long harbored private suspicions he'd never had proof enough to voice, called for a formal review of the assessment board's practices on the spot. Within the month, Vance's position on the board was quietly not renewed, and though he faced no criminal charge for what remained, technically, a legally defensible if deeply unethical practice, the county's assessment procedures were reformed with new oversight that closed the very loophole he had exploited for years, his particular justice arriving as the simple, permanent loss of the advantage his position had always given him. Ruth, for her part, used the recovered silver exactly as Henrietta Boone had always intended, distributing it among the 5 families' descendants she and Franklin Doyle had identified, several of whom wept openly at the meeting to learn a stranger's long-forgotten kindness had finally reached them across 3 decades of hardship. She kept for herself only enough to properly repair the saltworks boiling sheds and clear its silted channels, and within a year had the modest operation producing salt again, employing 2 of Henrietta's own verified descendant families in a quiet, deliberate echo of the arrangement that had once sustained them. The wages this time recorded openly in ledgers Ruth kept with her mother's same exacting honesty rather than hidden beneath any cart seat. And so we return, as we always do, to where this story began, to a woman of 44. Laughed at by a courthouse full of men for spending her last $5 on mud and ruin. Ruth Calloway did not buy that flooded saltworks because she saw silver waiting beneath an old cart seat. She bought it because her father had taught her that wood. And by extension, any neglected thing remembers how it was handled. And her mother had taught her that a woman who understands her own figures can never be told a false story about what those figures mean. What she found beneath that cart seat was never simply coin. It was one widow's unfinished kindness toward the people who depended on her. Interrupted by flood and circumstance, and it took another widow, one the county had tried to leave with nothing, to finish at last what that kindness had begun. Thank you for spending this time with Ruth's story, and with the families of the old Boone salt works. If it moved you, we would be grateful if you shared it with someone who needs reminding tonight that being laughed at for trusting your own instincts is never proof that those instincts were wrong. We would love to know, is there a time in your own life when you saw value in something everyone else had already dismissed as worthless? Tell us about it below. We read every story you leave us, and we are always glad to hear them. Until next time, stay close, *.